Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another edition of World Talks on TVP World, where every word matters. I'm your host, Benjamin Lee, and please join me and my guests on this next interview. Now, with evolving global dynamics, the European Union must adapt to a world undergoing significant shifts. The upcoming U.S. administration, led by Donald Trump, presents unique challenges, especially as it redefines traditional alliances and perspectives on global security. The question of America's stance towards Europe and NATO's support for Ukraine raises critical issues. Now, joining us today on TVP World to provide insight is Mantas Adomėnas, General Secretary of the Community of Democracies. Hello, sir, and welcome to TVP World.
Hello, good to be here.
So, can you help us understand how you see the role of Europe in this new era of U.S.-EU relationships?
I think the strategic answer for Europe now is very clear. Whether the new administration means retreat towards some degree of isolationism and withdrawal from European affairs, or whether it's wants to reforge the alliances with higher demands for European concern for their own security. The answer is the same. Europe must invest in its own defense. It must raise percentage of GDP spent on defense. It must be much more proactive in relaunching defense industries and in taking care of Russia's war in Ukraine. So whichever scenario plays out, I think the answer for Europe is the same. So there is no need for now to hesitate too much, but actually to start investing in defense.
Right, like you said, autonomy is perhaps the way to go either way the U.S. Election goes. Now, some people are trying to read the tea leaves a little bit when it comes to Trump's cabinet position picks and trying to see whether or not it'll show any indications of which way Trump is leaning when it comes to U.S.-EU relationship as well as U.S.-Ukrainian relationship. Do you have your own theories behind perhaps some of the Trump's cabinet pick, and can we tell how he's going to engage with this part of the world? Or do you think it's still a little too early to tell?
I suspect that first is far too early to tell. Secondly, the strategic dilemmas now are very different from the ones that the first Trump administration faced. That's to say, if then it was very clear choice of strategic attention towards Indo-Pacific versus Europe, now we see the coalescence of autocratic regimes in the axis of alliance of regimes stretching from North Korea and troops fighting on Ukrainian soil to Russia, Iran, China, reinforcing each other. So in a sense, and China is watching very closely to what is happening in Ukraine, and indication whether the West hesitates, whether the West blinks, is going to be for them the signal whether to take any military initiative vis-a-vis Taiwan or not. So in a sense, these things are much more interconnected, and attempt to read tea leaves and to try to determine from one name or the other what the policy is going to be is taking precious time from decisions which need to be made now, because Europe must become much more proactive. Whether we're facing America, which is going to be much more going to do it alone, then Europe has to have the wherewithal to withstand Russian pressure, or whether it needs alliances to face the rising threat of China, then Europe also must be much better prepared to be this valuable ally to act in the Indo-Pacific theater. In both cases, the answer is the same. So no need to read tea leaves. I think the need is to rearm.
Right. Now, Trump is known for his peace through strength agenda, or at least in rhetorically. Do you think that this might actually indicate that perhaps, like you mentioned, with the interconnectivity of the world as we see the new reality of the world, involvement of North Korea and China, would actually mean that there's a boost in American support for this side of the world in order to curb the advances of China, for example?
I cannot prophesy sort of what decisions will be taken, but observing the war from very close by, sort of for the last almost 3 years, it's very clear to me that in order to liberate resources to face the threats in the Indo-Pacific, America has to have a show of strength vis-à-vis Russia. That's to say, any appeasing moves will only be an encouragement for Russia to try further adventurous, further military adventures, further acts of aggression, and that will detract from America's as well as collective West's capability to face other threats elsewhere. So only being very tough on Russia now can sort of America ensure the sort of the stability in this part of the world and to liberate resources in other regions of the world.
Right, and I think, like you emphasized a lot during this interview, that it is very important for Europe to pursue its own defense autonomy. Do you think Europe is ready to take on the burden, and with the war stretching into like over 1,000 days, do you think that there is also political will to continue this kind of support?
I very much hope that decisions which will be made in the near days, weeks and months will prove that it is capable. You know, if I had looked at the collective level of European political will before the start of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, I would have said no, Europe was not capable of what it proved capable of afterwards. You know, providing all the support to Ukraine, lethal equipment, as well as financial support. So Europe is an evolving organism, and I think faced with this very stark strategic dilemma, I very much hope that the new European administration and new parliament will be able to mobilize collective political will in the conflict, which is going to be the defining conflict for the coming decades.
Right, and with the world still stretching on, there's also the concern of Ukraine fatigue, and perhaps some of the populace started questioning some of these spendings. Do you think that the politicians, the leader, will able to be effectively enough in communicating this message of how essential it is for Europe to pursue its own defensive autonomy?
It's a matter for politicians to find that language, but there can be no Ukraine fatigue, because it's not Ukraine fatigue, it's a fatigue over the global order. I mean, sort of if we let Russia win this episode, that means that it moves one step further in dismantling the post-World War II global order, which allowed us to enjoy these decades of peace and which allowed to have these last 3 decades of vacations from history, from which we're now awakening with great sort of pain and reluctance. But you know, this is what is at stake. It's the shape of the coming global order, and Ukraine is one skirmish in that war, and we cannot blink here. We cannot allow us Ukraine fatigue, because it's a fatigue about, in essence, our own fate and peace in Europe and security of NATO countries. So no, the answer is we have to find a way of combating that.
Right, and we've also seen an increasing in investment from not just NATO, but also the EU when it comes to defense. Do you think that's a kind of effective use of allocating resources? Are there going to be overlapping roles and perhaps ways that the strategic resources can be balanced in a way that it's more efficient and effective?
I'm sure there is a lot that European Union can do in order to supplement the role that NATO is playing. It is very important that there is no interference, there is no overlap, but investment in research and strategic industries, in investment in developing defense industries and cutting-edge technologies. This is all which is, you know, that is needed in order for NATO countries to be able to build up cutting-edge armies, which will be needed in the coming decades. So yes, I think Europe is underinvesting in those areas still, and this is in no way directly interferes with the role of NATO, which is irreplaceable.
And so how do you foresee Europe getting ready or taking action to reinforce this strategic autonomy and readiness amongst all these kind of global shifts?
First of all, it has to take geopolitical responsibility for its own neighborhood and not rely all the time on America stepping in and resolving it. And that is not only Ukraine. This is also conflicts in the Middle East. This is also migration processes, which can be a great destabilizer. So you know, it has to have to play a much more active geopolitical role in its own vicinity. And for that, of course, the new architecture of allocating resources for these needs, which are may not necessarily be direct military engagements, but this is definitely needed.
Do you see any challenges going forward, as we see the budget issue has also already caused Germany a little bit of political turmoil when it comes to the budgetary spending? And now one of the reasons why Germany was able to have a successful economy partly is due to the cheap defense provided by the United States. Do you think there might be any kind of bottlenecks or any financial kind of issue when it comes to pursuing this strategic autonomy that might cause some political points within the countries?
As I said, I mean, sort of awakening from the vacations from history is a painful process, but it needs to be done. There is no alternative. Otherwise, we're facing sort of war which will cost considerably more than this reorientation and reallocation of resources and sort of relaunching industries which will be needed to provide for Europe's strategic autonomy.
All right, so perhaps a very difficult time going forward. Now, I know you mentioned perhaps it's still too early to kind of determine how U.S. will act due to just Trump's pick, but one of the names being floated right now is Ellie Stefanik, Trump's pick for the UN ambassador, and she herself declined to stand by previous support for Ukraine in joining NATO. Do you think that's enough to signify that perhaps it is more important than ever to start really rethinking, and perhaps it's a strong enough message to be sent to other European leaders that are still thinking that there might be a chance for them to not have to be so self-sufficient?
I think it's very important that European leaders engage in dialogue with the new administration. It's not just about Ukraine. Of course, Ukraine is of paramount importance. But if the US thinks that it can win this long-term tectonic sort of competition with China, with other emerging sort of revisionist autocratic regimes on its own, it's hugely sort of misguided insofar as both in terms of technological development, in de-risking supply networks and export markets. Europe is needed, and we need to pool resources in terms of technological development, in terms of hybrid security effort, in terms of all sorts of economic, technological innovation measures in order to outplay the regimes which are challenging directly the supremacy and ultimately sort of survival of the Western democratic system. So, Europe must be sort of much readier to show its muscle in the Asia-Pacific theater, and has to realize it can't assume automatically for granted America's stepping in and resolving all the conflicts. But on the other hand, America must realize that without allies, this is the scale of challenges it's not going to face down alone.
Right. And last but not least, a lot of people describe Trump as a very transactional president. When it comes to his relation, even like foreign policy, is also a very transactional approach. Could that be leveraged to the Europeans' favor in a way that perhaps, well, to let Trump see some benefit when it comes to cooperating on European defense?
I'll end with what I started. I mean, sort of by stepping up its own defense, by offering to chip in sort of much more considerably in collective defense, and also in the supporting America's interests in other regions of the world. This is precisely the value that Europe can provide and can prove to America that it is a worthwhile ally. So whichever way sort of the new administration's course will develop, the answer is clear. And to quote my favorite character from Homer's Iliad, Hector, who says that there's always one prophetic omen which is always valid: defend your own homeland. So this is what Europe has to do now.
All right, brilliant. Defend your own homeland. Thank you so much for your input and insight. I really appreciate it. And thanks for being with us on TVP World. Cheers. And thank you for watching this edition of World Talks. But for more news, update, and commentary, please stay tuned to TVP World.